Awesome. So I'm Orta Therox. I'm a guy who's been doing open source now for at least since I was about 16, which probably was about 12 years. I even got myself a cute little tattoo that says "free" on my arm when I was very, very young. And quite recently, within the last 2 years, I've been working on a project that has completely redefined how open source works for iOS developers. Basically what we had originally is disparate libraries of code everywhere that people would just copy and paste some of the code into their folders and their projects. They'd have to change a bunch of C settings. And what we've done here is we've tried to automate as much of this as possible. And we've started with small response. That's the general gist. And I get started. So, to get you guys started, I always believe when you're at a talk, you should tell everybody your credentials. Why is people worth listening to me? What stand do I have in this? I've always found that the best way to judge someone's open source kind of report card is to go look at their GitHub profile. So in this case, you can see that I've contributed publicly for the entire year, daily mostly. I've big long streaks. I've worked on very large projects that have got thousands and thousands of stars. You guys are all like hardware people. I, on the other hand, unfortunately, don't have that much experience with hardware. I build straight up for iOS and for the Mac only. So I don't know how many ideas cross-pollinate between the two. I've never seen like the ideas of using dependency management, like hardware API projects and stuff like that. But for us, this was quite a serious problem. We had no tooling other than what Apple gave us. We had no way of being able to pull everything together and just get all your dependencies sorted. So we wanted to try and figure this problem out. And what we did for that was we used something called CocoaPods. And CocoaPods allows us to do something quite similar to how Bundler works for Ruby, how I think pip works for Python, Maven for Java. It's this kind of idea of being able to allow you to specify a recipe for how a project can be pulled into another project. When you're starting to work on very large projects, like once the iPad came out, suddenly you weren't making trivial apps. You were making apps that had hundreds of screens and thousands of different views and tons of different interactions. It started to become a real problem in the community about how you can actually share these widgets together and how you can really do open source work. It was very difficult to actually have a project out, to have it with a changelog, to have it with release notes, to have ideas of whether it will be compatible with older versions. And what we tried to do with this tool called CocoaPods was to try and make it standardized. And what ended up happening was CocoaPods started to become what the movie industry call a tentpole movie, which is the idea that you have this one big summer blockbuster, and because of that, people start going to the cinema more often. So what we did with CocoaPods was create this one project that made it super, super easy for people to contribute back to open source and to actually use open source itself. It deals with things like licensing. So because all apps are essentially like embedded and sort of system linked together, you actually have different kind of ways to deal with licenses. So things like the BSD license, which requires that you to bring the actual license file in to your project and to actually state somewhere in your app that you are using this code. We tried to make that really simple because previous to this, I'm sure you'll see this on lots of programs, that people don't really put things in their about stating all the licenses. They are effectively breaking their license at this point because you have to state what tools you've been using in there, and you have to give names and attribute attribution, sorry. And again, none of this stuff was being done, and it was coming to a point where without this tool to do all this stuff for you, people just weren't doing it. So what ended up happening is we built a system for bringing in code and letting people contribute. But what ended up happening was we ended up becoming the third biggest and most active repository on GitHub. We have over 1,500 contributors now. We've got 6,000 separate library files that people are regularly editing every day. I think I've got some of those notes down a bit further. But we had a problem because, well, it's not really a problem, I guess. It's a different way of thinking about how we build a large tool. But, at this point, I think our download count is about 220,000 downloads and installs of our tool, which basically means if you've used any iOS app in the last year or so, you've probably had something run through this tool. We needed to find ways to deal with a team that could be potentially hundreds of people, and one day it could be 3 or 4, the other day we have multiple disparate projects that are all somewhat interconnected but somewhat not. So we're talking like the websites, the documentation, the guides, the IRC channels, the mailing lists, the GitHub issues, trying to keep all these things together and trying to keep the people so everybody knows what's going on around the community. It turns into quite an interesting problem. So I call this our nomadic team. And we're a team of people that mainly are from Europe, but we have Americans, Australians, Russians, all on sort of the core team. And how we try and communicate between all of us is usually we all coalesce into one big chat room. Again, it's usually like 10 to 8 to 12 people on an average day. And we'll try and act as sort of the benevolent dictators, but we all discuss it at the same time. So it's a way of trying to deal with, how do we deal with thousands of contributors whilst having a core dev team that could be very unreliable. At this point, I've not been working on CocoaPods now for 2 months because iOS 7 launch is coming so soon, and I've got an app that's coming out there. And we've had to kind of go with the ebb and flow of dealing with people not being here, people coming and going. Sometimes we just have someone that appears out of nowhere that would end up releasing a very, very large feature, like on a GitHub pull request that could take potentially over months, hundreds of different commits just for this one feature, and then we never see him again. We never have any more communications. He doesn't want to come back and maintain it, which is fine, because by the time that we've gone through this very long process, we're happy with it. It's fully tested, and the feature is now effectively ours. But we ourselves, as the core dev team, never specifically had the intention of building this. But someone just came out of nowhere, built it for us, and then effectively said, "It's yours." And we have to kind of find ways of dealing with this kind of nature of open source. One of my tools that I built for CocoaPods is this thing called CocoaDocs, which is it's a bit like Ruby docs. So every single open source library gets around through this very complex parser that turns it into the same kind of documentation that Apple would give you. And only over the weekend I got a random feature out of the blue from someone that I'd never heard of. He'd made a program I'd never even used before, and he'd gone and added support for his program and from the server side to then have this kind of two-way communication between my app and his app, which would really change the fundamental nature of how this website works. And I didn't have to do anything but then hit the deploy button afterwards. And this is really useful because, as I said, with a disparate nomadic team, I can't be guaranteed to be free to work on any of the projects that I've started for CocoaPods or maintaining them. Having someone else just come by and do it and then disappear is kind of perfect, but it becomes a bit difficult with maintaining. And one of the interesting aspects of having this nomadic team is that it means that there's like a permanent time for people working on the app. So there's so much overlap between all these different time zones, we can almost rely on there always being someone to deal with an issue or a mailing list or trying to get people in and bring them into our internal chat room so that we can discuss the issues further. So I want to show you guys a little bit of like some of the stats that we've had. So we started off really small for quite a very long time. I think about here we ended up hitting the third most active repository on GitHub, which was, and the only people above us now are Rails and AlphaGov, the British government's website, which runs on GitHub, it seems. And we've been trying to find ways to, encourage more people to do this, because we're having a bit of a problem at this point, because a lot of this is still a manual process. So we've got 6,000 libraries in 2 years, and that's 45 new ones, 140 updated, and 4,000 pull requests. And these pull requests are all manually merged. So there is always somebody who goes, reads it, we check the linter, so in order to try and speed up this process, we have extensive usage of Travis CI. We've been on their beta. We were the first people to support, they added some Mac instances of Travis CI, so we were their beta tester, which was effectively for them, they were getting hundreds and hundreds of small commits to test all the service for Mac developers later. And we were using CocoaPods to do this. So what we get then is the actual people that are doing the pull requests don't have to go and pull it down, merge it themselves, test it locally. We can have these really, really advanced linting systems that mean that we don't have to spend so much time saying whether or not this is going to break the entire system. Because one of the downsides of building an entire dependency management chain around GitHub means that effectively anyone that can get code in can effectively change anything. So let's say one of the most popular libraries has someone surreptitiously change the URL or add a shell script at the end that pulls down, takes source code out of their documents folder. We actually have to manually check to make sure this doesn't happen. I mean, luckily, because it's, again, one of the advantages of being on Git is that every single change is a commit. So we can go through and see, just revert any kind of malicious changes. They don't happen so often, but they do happen. And that's still why we have to deal with this kind of manual pull request system. We've been starting to experiment with the idea of having a automatic linting system that would effectively take the changes, the delta from what someone wants to do to update the library, and that would then go to a separate service. The separate service would then pull the changes, it would run them all locally and sandboxed, and then we would say if that works, then we can actually merge it. Which ideally should reduce the amount of pull requests we get per week significantly. So these are like some of the ways that we've been trying to simplify our lives as the people that should ideally be spending most of our time working on the actual tool itself rather than trying to work around the tool, because we are creating a big community here. I know like 1,000, my girlfriend this morning said 1,500 people, that's not very much. And conceptually it isn't, but as the iOS and Mac dev community isn't that big. Apple stated last year that they'd had 100,000 downloads of their beta of iOS 6, I think, which is enough to kind of give you a sense of the scale of like our community. We've got so effectively at this point we're looking at 1% of the community are actually contributing back to open source, which in my opinion is actually quite big. So we're kind of excited, and I think that that's a nice way for people to contribute back to the system. So I thought I'd grab some of the kind of examples of people that would just come in out of nowhere and give us huge amounts of code. And this guy, Ian YH, he had a feature, he wanted it in, we spent quite a while with him dealing with all the pull requests. I think this one took about a month. And it was back and forth in between the core members, our automated systems, so we use coveralls, I think, on the Ruby side to deal with automatic testing with our apps rather than with the community stuff. And this guy came in, made a single feature, we had him in our IRC for maybe a week or two, and then after that he just disappeared. We had the exact same thing here with dedicated targets. This was a huge pull request. It's like 6,000 lines of code, and it took over 2 months. There's 57 separate commits on this pull request. This is a very long-running discussion between the core devs and someone that just wants to make a single feature, which would make a huge change to the actual fundamental architecture. And so we had lots of people just coming in with their ideas about why and how. And so we try and make every time that somebody wants to make any sort of contribution, we feel it's really in our interest to kind of encourage people to do this. So whenever we get pull requests like this, we'll go in and help as much as possible, submit commits to their pull request to try and help them along if it's gonna, contests and things like that, not keep the flow going. Once we've actually got someone in and got the actual commit merged, we'll add their name to the changelog, give them as much credit as possible at this point. We'll tweet about it for a few, maybe 2 or 3 times on a single day to try and get it into all the time zones. We have quite a popular Twitter feed because every time a new library updates, it automatically will go on the Twitter. So, for someone that's just wanting to write a small, not in this case not so small, but just wanting to actually write some code for a project that they use, we try and give as much kind of credit back to them to say, this specific person has done something that's going to affect so many people. We want you to feel like you're getting a lot of credit for working in the open source world. And to try and encourage this, to foster it, we actually end up doing one more thing that's kind of useful. I maintain the easy first step label on our GitHub issues, which is a really nice jump-in point for people to just say, I want to contribute, but I don't know how. For us, the people that will be using this tool are Objective-C developers, which means they've lived in C basically all their life probably. And our tool is not built in Objective-C, it's built in Ruby. So for a lot of people, this is a completely foreign language and a completely kind of foreign feel in comparison to this big, heavy language, that we wanted to try and make it so that the dev team don't always take the easy ones in order to encourage people to actually come out of the woodwork, to take a nice, simple issue and to just kind of get their teeth bit on the system itself. And I've been finding that this has been working really well. I have to go through and add a few more every now and again because people do them. And we encourage it on the website, so we have lots of ways of saying you can contribute. You can either contribute by writing open source, which is great for everyone. If you want to kind of contribute on the project itself, then we offer the easy first step. And once you're in there, we'll usually kind of invite you into the core dev chat room and get people in. And once they're in, then we've pretty much got them. And everyone that's kind of ended up doing something like 2 or 3 large pull requests then becomes kind of synonymous with the team. And we're doing really good at actually keeping people in the the dev team, I don't know, as I said, it's nomadic, so like the core stays, I guess. And so that's mainly from how we deal with developers of the project. But we always, as with everyone, we have users. And users want feedback. Users want to be able to get support. And so we want to try and find ways that are convenient for everyone. So when people send us a tweet with a support request, then it's usually, we'll say, please send it to Stack Overflow. Because tweets are great for like that 10-second question that you had, but no one's going to like Google search and find a tweet. People will naturally flock to Stack Overflow for sort of simple questions or almost anything. So we maintain a big hashtag for CocoaPods, and it's full of people that I've never met or had any interactions with on the actual CocoaPod site itself that are only answering questions because they know it and they want to gain the Stack Overflow internet credits. So that's worked really well for us, the idea of letting support requests go into somewhere more permanent. Then we have the sort of mailing list, which to me is a bit more ambiguous. It allows discussion, a mailing list, in a way that's a lot better than Stack Overflow. And perhaps GitHub issues is maybe on par in terms of convenience. It's a lot easier to just throw some hits around, that's for sure. But the mailing list allows people to just rant for long periods of time. And for users, that's very good, because it means that we can parse it through, figure out the problem, ask for more context. And it effectively acts as like a less focused version of the GitHub issues. And GitHub issues are usually, we'll maintain this, so we'll prune things that don't make sense. We'll always try and make sure all the issues are valid and within the right time frame, on the right project. They'll always try and have a reply straight away so that people don't feel like they've just given something into the void, and they'll get tagged appropriately. So it sounds like it takes a lot of time, but it usually isn't, because there's loads of great kind of command line tools for dealing with GitHub issues. My recommendation is one called GHI. Big fan of that. And yeah, we don't use Twitter. We don't think it's a very good idea for dealing with large support requests. So because it's so big, we have to deal with lots of separate projects too. The core dev team, being about 10 to 12 people, don't just entirely work on one project. So we have something like, we have 3 or 4 major side projects that I wanted to bring up. That I really want to talk a little bit, not specific about the projects, but how we deal with the projects. Because we have this core dev team, they created something that's a lot like a package manager for your actual plugins for your main tool that you'd work in. We tried to then make it feel like it was part of the CocoaPods brand, because it was a valid tool from the same people. It meant that it was very easy for us to just start tweeting it, giving it a Twitter account of its own, getting the same people that would be interested in working on CocoaPods interested in working on this tool too,